Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to try and untangle a really complex and, honestly, often misunderstood idea, multicultural education. So let's start with the big question, right? What is multicultural education really? I mean, you've probably heard the term thrown around, but what it actually means, that often gets lost in the noise. At its heart, though, it's this idea that our schools should reflect and really include all the different backgrounds that make up our country. And this right here? This gets to a super important distinction. You know, for a lot of schools, multiculturalism looks like a special event. Maybe it's a diversity week, or celebrating different cultures with food and festivals. And look, that stuff is usually well-intentioned, but a lot of scholars would say that only scratches the surface. For them, it's a way deeper process. It's about fundamentally reshaping learning itself by asking, okay, whose values, whose worldview, and whose version of knowledge are we actually putting front and center in the classroom? All right, so to really get to the bottom of this, here's our game plan. First, we'll dig into the roots of the movement. Then, we'll unpack how society really shapes what happens in schools. After that, we'll look at a major clash of philosophies. And finally, we'll get into the core debate that's still very much alive today.
Okay, first up, the roots. Yeah, this whole idea didn't just pop up out of nowhere. You can think of it like several powerful historical movements flowing together, like tributaries, eventually forming this big, wide river of thought.
And you can see a really clear evolution on this timeline. It kind of starts back in the 1940s with something called intergroup education. This was right after World War II, and the goal was basically to promote tolerance, to ease racial tensions. But it didn't really dig into the systemic stuff. Then, boom, the 1960s civil rights movement completely changes the game. People weren't just asking for tolerance, they were demanding integration and calling out biased curriculum. That fight led directly to the birth of ethnic studies. A huge moment was in 1968, when the country's first Black Studies major was created. And by the 70s, you see all these different movements realizing they have common goals. And that's when they merged into this broader, multi-ethnic framework, which is pretty much the direct ancestor of what we talk about today.
So why does all this history matter? Well, to really get it, we have to accept a pretty big idea. Education is never neutral. It's always being shaped by the society around it, by the laws, the values, and the power structures.
And that brings us to this really crucial term, institutional discrimination. Now, the key idea here is that inequality isn't always about one person being prejudiced against another. Sometimes inequality is baked right into the system itself, into the rules, the policies, the standard ways of doing things that can end up putting certain groups at a disadvantage, often without anyone even meaning for it to happen.
Let's make this concrete. We're going to look at a really powerful modern example of how this plays out in the real world from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina.
So, get this. A local law was passed in a mostly white parish that said property owners could only rent to their blood relatives. Now, notice, the rule doesn't say anything about race, not a word. But what was the real-world effect? Well, it pretty much blocked Black families who didn't have blood relatives there from being able to move back into their community. That policy was eventually struck down in court, but it's such a clear example of how a rule that seems neutral on the surface can have a deeply discriminatory impact. This whole situation brings up another really critical idea, the difference between equal and equitable. Now, equal education would mean every single student gets the exact same thing, the same book, the same lecture. But think about that for a second. If you give an English language learner the same complex novel as a native speaker, is that really a fair shot? Not really. And that's where equitable education comes in. It's not about everyone getting the same stuff, it's about every student getting the resources they need to have a real opportunity to succeed. And that idea ties right into something called cultural capital. And this is basically the symbolic credit you get for having experiences that the dominant culture tends to value. Things like, having gone to preschool or having a computer at home. But here's the kicker. Every student walks into school with valuable knowledge and life experience. The problem pops up when the school only recognizes and rewards one specific kind of capital, which can put other students at a disadvantage right from day one. Okay, so if you agree with all this, how do you actually do it? How do you put it into practice? Well, this is where things get really interesting because it leads to a major philosophical clash with two very different ideas about the right way forward.
And this slide lays out the core tension perfectly. On one side, you've got pluralism, a view most famously associated with the historian Diane Ravitch. The idea here is that America has one single common culture that's made richer by all its contributing subcultures. The focus is on what we all share. Then, on the other side, you have particularism from scholars like Ronald Takaki. This perspective says, hold on, a single common culture isn't really achievable, or maybe even what we should be aiming for. Instead, students learn best when the curriculum is centered on their own specific ethnic and cultural background.
Now, that pluralist view, while it sounds great, this idea of a beautiful mosaic, it does face a pretty significant criticism. The argument goes like this. Even when you're trying to build one common culture, it often ends up having a default setting. That default can unintentionally center European American history and perspectives. So instead of a truly balanced picture, you risk creating a skewed one, where one group's story is the main event and others are just additions. This can end up downplaying the very unique struggles and histories of non-dominant groups.
So, you can see this is way more than just some abstract argument for academics to have. This gets to the very heart of a debate about identity, about history, and really about what kind of society we want to be.
So, what's the big takeaway here? When you boil it all down, it's this. Multicultural education is so much more than just a chapter in a textbook on diversity or celebrating a holiday. It's really a fundamental challenge to how we've traditionally thought about school. It forces us to ask tough questions about how knowledge gets made, whose stories get told, and who gets to see their own experience as a central part of the American story.
And that leaves us with this final, really provocative question that sits at the very core of this whole debate. Is the main goal of education to build one common, unified culture? Or is it to empower many strong, distinct ones? And there is absolutely no easy answer to that.